I want to talk about women in ancient texts and in literature from historical cultures because I find it really interesting. I mean, if we look at a story like Gilgamesh and the way that the women are depicted in the story, they are celebrated for their sexuality and for their wisdom. If we look at the character, the harlot, which that word has a very different context in the story than I think the word harlot would mean today. And I think that maybe that story being translated into modern day text, they threw that word in there, but it's very nuanced within the story. She is a woman of a temple. She is highly esteemed. And when she's introduced into the story, um she is like fetched by this farmer and his son, because the character Enkidu is this animalistic character that is ravaging all of the hunt in this village. And so they're like, oh, what do? We need to go get the harlot. And then the harlot comes and she lays with Enkidu and connects him to humanity. He then abandons these animalistic characteristics and becomes a man. It's very symbolic to where her femininity is so powerful, it grants him humanity. And in the text itself, it's the act of her laying with him, the act of her being naked, is literally described as the woman's art, which I just find completely beautiful. And it isn't like this thing that is frowned upon or shamed upon, but it is celebrated. She is celebrated within the text. She's celebrated for her power to bring a man that is like a creature and morph him into a man. It says that he then becomes weak but wise. And she's a wise character in the tale. She then goes on to teach him, to clothe him, and she brings him closer to civilization. She brings him back into the city, and she's the one that introduces him to Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is the main character, the hero of this tale. And Gilgamesh is basically the personification of brute strength. But every time he is looking for an ounce of wisdom, he turns to his mother. And his mother is the one that comforts him. Even though he is like this literally the personification of brute strength. Like, if there's any other way for me to describe Gilgamesh in a phrase or a sentence, it would be the personification of brute strength. But he still looks for comfort in his mother, who is a woman who he views as this extremely wise person. And I find it very fascinating that in such an ancient world like Mesopotamia, women were valued for innately feminine attributes, that it had a lot of value to society, that is later on shunned upon and shamed. And now if we move forward through history, a literary scholar who I love is Sappho. And Sappho is basically the mother of lesbians. The word sapphic is derived from Sappho, and she's from the island of Lesbos, which again, the word lesbian literally derives from she is mother of lesbians. And although queerness existed in ancient Greece, it still wasn't something that was very accepted by society. And I think because of this, a lot of Sappho's poetry and literature has been lost. We only have about like 7% of it. And she was a feminist icon of her time. I mean, she really wrote about just hating men and the concept of marriage, which, women didn't do at the time. The women didn't speak out against marriage. She has a poem called One Girl where she is talking about how marriage ruins a woman, how she talks about girls and women as these beautiful symbolic fruits, but once they're picked, they're basically trampled on and just ruined. Men ruin everything. That's basically what Sappho is saying. while also touching on the idea that women seem to only be picked or valued by society if they're beautiful. So not only is she talking against the concept of marriage, but she's also talking against the concept of societal pressures when it comes to beauty. There's also another poem by her that I love, and she is talking about these two lovers, about a woman and a man, and she talks about the man with just so much envy and how this woman loves him and she doesn't fucking get it, which I think is a very common experience when it comes to being a girl and being gay. So she is the first queer and feminist icon. Thank you, ancient Greece. And speaking of Greek texts, another piece of literature that I really love is the Greek tragedy of Antigone. Antigone is a woman of high status, but there's a civil war going on in the place where she lives, and two of her brothers are on opposite sides of the war. One of them dies, and she goes against the law and gives him a proper burial, to then which pisses off her father, and he sentences her to death. But she is the hero of this tale. When we look at Greek tragedies and Greek myths, and we address the concept of what a hero is to them at the time, she embodies all of it. She is someone who is noble, she is someone who is brave, and she is someone who dies with honor, which was a big thing in ancient Greece. On her deathbed, she tells her dad off, and she's like, what laws did I break under the god? What laws did I break under our gods? I broke your city law, sure, but you are just a king. And I choose to die by this. I choose to die by my integrity. And you will suffer pain of loneliness. So congratulations, Dad. You asked for this. Which he does. He dies sad and alone. But another thing I find really fascinating about these women in these literary texts is in times in societies and cultures where they weren't given a lot of agency, they seem to find a way to create their own agency. When we look at the story of Gilgamesh, I think that it could be interpreted that the harlot had no choice but to go and lay with Enkidu and do all of these things. But after she does, she then continues to be his friend. And I think that that is an act of her own agency. And I think with historical context, in a time when people lived more as a village, I think that she was fetched not because she was going to be forced to do this act, but because the people knew of the power and femininity that she had, and she would be able to do this act. And I think that honestly, the harlot in that text has like the most agency in a lot of historical texts that I have personally read. And then if we look at Sappho, she is really exercising her agency, regardless of what society of ancient Greece has to say about being queer. She just trudges on full force, and she writes these poems, and she speaks on, I think, the female experience that is really silenced a lot throughout history. The female experience is heavily silenced. And then on the topic of agency, we look at Antigone, where, yes, she was put to death, but by her own choice. She knew that she was going to be put to death if she gave her brother a proper burial, and she did it anyway because she wanted to stay true to her morals and who she was as a person and keep her own agency. So basically, my point is women in literature and in historical texts are really cool and awesome. Go women.